Welcome to week 3. I wanted to start this week by reflecting on last week and the work that you did for project 2. I argued last week that there are many creative processes, and you all illustrated this quite well with your work.
Here are just a few examples of your creative process visualizations, which span from conceptual to very concrete, and from hand-drawn to digitally created. Some of you are really literal in your representations, like who wrote, "Black arrows at the edge represent the flow of my creative process. This is called relation. The blue dot arrow connects those circles are representing my thoughts." Is actually jumping around between different scenes when I'm making a story. I keep changing and adding sentences. This process is called reflection. During the processes, I would keep filtering and picking what scene I should extend more. Further, I'd type these into my laptop or draw them on the paper, which is represented by the red arrow, meaning extension from the brain to the graph to the words. This process is called realization. These 3 R's, relation, reflection, and realization, represent the model of my creative process. And some of you are more conceptual, like Brandon, who visualized and explained his creative process conceptually, likening it to a road trip. He said, "Much like traveling from one place to another, the process of creating something has a start point and an end point. In between these 2 points is where directions in the creative process collide. With the complex road system we have in place, one can take many different paths to get to a final destination. Some pathways are more direct than others, offering a faster, easier solution, and some require a more intricate set of directions. This is much like the creative process in the way that there's not always a clear-cut path to the solution. One must try out different techniques or tools to achieve the final product. Also, when traveling from one destination to another, the route one ends up taking may contain obstacles such as traffic, accidents, or irritating Michigan drivers." You all had some stellar comments to make as you reflected on your creative process. For instance, Brittany said, "My creative process has a mixing stage and a blending stage. The mixing stage is procedural and the ingredients or components are laid out and added step by step, like a person mixing cake batter. The blending stage is when I can just kind of throw anything or any thoughts into my creative process." Matt said, "Generating as many ideas as possible is important because it's essential to building the strength of the idea muscle." Zhao mentioned that an unexpected experience is also helpful to innovate. "I believe the creative process is a round trip. It should be backwards and forwards." And Andrew stated that imagination is how it begins, and creativity is executing the idea.
The focus of this week's readings and Creativity Sparks is on interviews with and representations of the creative approaches and inspiration sparks of others. You're going to read and see some interviews with creative people about how they find inspiration for their creativity. And then, for Project 3, you're going to document your own sources of creative inspiration. Our first reading for this week is a chapter by Tina Seelig called Spark a Revolution. And in it, Seelig talks about shifting your perspective and learning to look and think differently. Connected to her chapter is a creativity case, a short film made in 1977 called Powers of 10, which Seelig mentions in her chapter. To think about where others find sources of inspiration, invention, and creativity, next we're going to read a few pieces that report on interviews with creatives. First, there's a link to 9 different interviews. Take a look at them, maybe read the overviews, and choose one to focus in on and read carefully. I don't care which one. Choose one that interests you. Then I've linked to another interview with an information and graphic designer called Frank Chimero, in which he talks about his creative and designerly processes and how he sparks his imagination, and there are tons of examples of his work included in the interview. The third reading for this week is made up of excerpts that I pulled from a book called Inspiration Equals Ideas. What you'll be reading are the lists of creativity sources that the artists and creatives describe as their go-to spots where they look for creative inspiration. Some mention coffee shops, some mention particular TV shows, some mention other artists, some mention flea markets. It's really interesting to see what sorts of places really creative people go to get their creative juices flowing. And this reading should be really helpful and somewhat of a model for what you're going to do with Project 3. Moving into the creativity cases, the first is of Chris Jordan. I hope that many of you have already seen his work. He's an amazing artist who makes pretty compelling arguments about the environment and about our world with his work. You'll be watching a Bill Moyers interview with Jordan. A second creativity case is that of Alexander McQueen, who died in 2010 but was one of the most provocative and productive fashion designers ever. You'll read the last interview conducted with him before his death, read some of his most famous quotes, and explore an exhibit of his work at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And there are also two interesting creativity sparks that round out this week's readings and materials. In some ways, being creative is like writing. Most of us don't just magically do or invent something creative. We have a process. We need to brainstorm. We need to imagine. We need inspiration. We need to prototype. We need to test. Last week, I talked about brainstorming processes used in business, like that of Walt Disney, Pixar, and IDEO. Today, I want to share 3 inspiration sparks or creative exercises that are more general and that we might engage in. Quite a few of you in your Project 1 websites mention that creativity often builds on what already exists. Creativity doesn't have to involve creating something brand new from scratch. Often, rather, creativity happens when someone looks differently at something that exists or imagines a new possibility for a tool or an object. We'll read some of Austin Kleon's work later in class, but my first example of inspiration is from his new book, Show Your Work. In it, he includes this example. A drawing of a tuba. He asks, what was it made for? How are others using it? What use can I find for it? One way to reimagine a tuba, especially when it's old and maybe can't be retuned or used, might be as a planter. Another object we might have to look differently at are old computers. We generate tons and tons of electronic waste every year. How might we better put to use our old computers? One way might be as an aquarium. My second example of inspiration sparking is from a book by a designer called Jim Krause. And I love this exercise. Krause argues that although we spend a lot of time looking at words and text, we don't spend enough time thinking about words and text or appreciating text as a design object. For instance, look at these different letters E. Each has its own unique curve and shape. They're all recognizable as a lowercase English alphabet E. And we see that and we recognize it, but each has its own flourishes and embellishments. Krause suggests as an inspiration activity, choosing one letter in one font face and creating a portrait of or for that letter, choosing a background, colors, and other elements to complement the design of the letter. Here's one of his examples. And here's one I just created. I chose the uppercase D, mainly because my first name starts with it. I chose to set it in a scripted, flourishy font face. It's called Chopin. The font face makes me think of the serene, nature-based, impressionist paintings. So I selected an impressionist painting by Claude Monet to set the letter on for its portrait. Okay. My third and last inspiration spark suggestion comes from a book by Alan Fletcher titled The Art of Looking Sideways. One of his suggestions in the book is engaging in creative addition, taking bits and pieces of related things to create, compile, or collage something new. And here's an example from the book. This is actually a poster created for the National Portrait Gallery in London. The artist created the poster by taking pieces of different paintings and collaging them together. I just put together one myself with slices of faces. And you can see it here. You can creatively add to just about anything in a range of ways. So those are 3 examples of creativity spark and inspiration warm-ups. For project 3, I want you all to identify and reflect on the sources you go to get inspired and think creatively. The full assignment and some example project 3 work is on D2L in the week 3 folder. What I want you to do essentially for project 3 is to create 2 lists. One should be a list of where you currently and already find inspiration. The other list should be a list of where you'd like to find inspiration, maybe a place you haven't visited yet, a tool you haven't had a chance to play with yet. Your product will be one Word document with the 2 lists included. And I do want you to include a bit of explanation for each item in your list and examples or illustrations where you can. And again, there's some models and an example in the Project 3 folder on D2L. So that's our work and our focus for week 3. As usual, don't be shy. Email me. Let me know if you have questions. Otherwise, happy reading, happy writing, happy creating.